Welcome to the Climate Diplomacy Podcast, a podcast from the Berlin-based Think and Do tank Adelphi, bringing you the latest insights and debates in international climate diplomacy and security. We are your hosts, Raquel Monayer.
And I'm Alexandra Steinkraus. In this series, you will hear from experts and practitioners offering their take on climate foreign policy, climate-related impacts to security, and promoting peace and resilience in a changing climate. For more information, please visit climate-diplomacy.org or follow @ClimateDiplo on Twitter. Hello to our listeners. Welcome back to the Climate Diplomacy Podcast. We do have a special request at the end of the episode, so stay tuned. Today, we are joined by one of our new Climate Security Expert Network members, Ali Nasrallah. He is a consultant and researcher with a diverse background working on climate change, peace building, and green energy policy. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Really glad that you're here joining us today.
Yeah, same.
To start us off with a little bit of background for our audience, can you start us off by outlining what kind of climate change impacts are being seen throughout the Middle East and North African region, and how are these impacts changing different dynamics when it comes to conflict, social cohesion, socioeconomic dynamics, etc.?
Yeah, definitely. So to start with, I'm calling today from Jordan. We are experiencing a heat wave here and across the MENA region because of a heat dome. So we experienced temperatures in Jordan last week that are up to 7, maybe to 9 degrees above normal levels. And this makes a big difference, you know? So for example, a 30 degrees day in the capital Amman, which is kind of normal in June, would be usually, with very low humidity, a mild and pleasant day. You can even tolerate it without a fan. But like a day with 39 degrees, it's an extremely different case. You need an air conditioning unit to become more tolerable. So this is a big difference, and we can see it across the region. Also, the port city of Aqaba recorded the third highest temperature in the world on Friday, and the highest temperature ever recorded there in June. So this is the backdrop. I'm feeling it right now while I'm calling you. But, you know, on a more grand scheme level of things, the resilience of different communities across the MENA region depends on many factors, including socioeconomic factors, location, and the prevalence of war. Jordan has one of the highest share of refugees per capita in the world and high poverty rate of almost 24%. So unfortunately, these circumstances add to the vulnerability of facing extreme weather conditions, such as this heat wave we are experiencing now, and other vulnerabilities such as food security and access to water. So these circumstances become even more acute when looking at countries such as Syria and Lebanon, which have very limited access to electricity. And when talking about peace and climate in general, we need to understand that these are things that are intrinsically political issues, and the political nature of these topics can be seen even more clearly in the MENA region. So, for example, corruption and war in Lebanon caused the failure of the national electricity grid, and most people rely on standalone small diesel generators for electricity to cope with the long hours of daily blackouts. This model is extremely inefficient, and it's very expensive and causes air pollution in Lebanon and contributes negatively to climate change, which becomes a vicious circle, kind of. Moreover, we cannot talk about the MENA region today without talking about the Israeli war in Gaza. First and foremost, the human loss and suffering is absolutely tragic and infuriating. But also on a climate level, this is absolutely disastrous. So the Israeli army has used more than 75,000 tons of bombs in Gaza, which is the equivalent of 5 Hiroshima bombs, or more than all the bombs dropped on London, Dresden, and Hamburg during World War II. Again, here the human loss and suffering is the most tragic in this situation, but also the climate footprint of such destruction is absolutely horrible. So, according to the UN, 72% of all residential buildings have been completely or partially destroyed. And the reconstruction of Gaza is estimated to cost something around $40 billion, making it one of the biggest reconstruction efforts since World War II. So such a reconstruction needs the production of materials with high carbon footprint, such as steel, cement, and concrete. And a new study puts the carbon footprint around 60 million tons of carbon. So This is higher than the annual emissions of more than 135 countries together. Moreover, with the heat wave on a more personal level, there are 1.5 million people that are displaced, and quoting the Climate Center, heat waves add to an extra layer of suffering to an already catastrophic humanitarian situation. So famine can already be seen in Gaza, and 95% of Gazan population has no access to clean water. So, with this war and climate, peace and security, it's all integrated and it's all feeding into each other. And when talking about climate and security in the MENA region, we always need to talk about what's happening on a political level and the wars that are happening here as well.
Yeah, thanks very much for getting us started outlining some of these different dynamics in the region, as well as some of these trends when it comes to climate change. And I want to come back to some of the ongoing conflicts and a little bit about this kind of environmental climate impacts of war. But I think on the podcast, water scarcity is a topic that we haven't covered in actually quite some time. We've covered food security relatively recently and some of these other dynamics that you've mentioned, but I'm wondering if you could outline the growing water scarcity felt throughout the region and the kind of impacts that this specifically is having.
Yes, absolutely. So the MENA region is among the world's most vulnerable regions when it comes to climate change and to water scarcity. The region is warming faster than the global average, which is very scary because it's a very vulnerable ecosystem here. And with that comes another big looming problem, which is water scarcity. So according to the UN, the MENA region is the most water scarce region in the world, with 11 of the 17 most water stressed countries in the MENA region. So the effects of water scarcity can already be seen on peace and security, with tensions rising between countries that share common water resources, such as Turkey, Syria, and Iraq, Jordan, Palestine, and Israel, and Ethiopia, and Egypt, and Sudan. This can lead to catastrophic problems, and the conflicts and security problems that can arise are really, really disastrous. So also, as the region heats quickly, people will need even more water resources to deal with the heat and for personal use and for agriculture. So this would probably lead to migration towards areas with more water resources, but at the same time creating more stress on these resources and possibly creating new communal tensions.
Before I move on to green energy policy, oftentimes on the podcast and kind of with this climate, peace, and security nexus, we talk a lot about narratives. And I think threat multiplier or risk multiplier, especially in the context of the MENA region, is something that we see a lot. Do you kind of find that framing to be helpful? I know oftentimes within Adelphi and within our climate security program, we talk about kind of it also creates new risks as well. So I'd be interested in getting your input a bit on what kind of narrative is best to introduce these threats and these risks.
Yeah, definitely. So I believe in the threat multiplier and that narrative, but I also believe that climate security is causing new problems too as well. So it's not only the multiplier, but it's sometimes the root cause of many issues that are rising in the region here. The water problems and security problems arising from water scarcity is one of these cases where we can see that it's actually the root cause of the problem and it's not only a multiplier. So it might be helpful to think of it as a multiplier and use a climate security framework to think about different problems, but at the same time, it needs to be acknowledged as a source and a big source of many of these climate security issues.
So now moving a bit more into the energy transition itself and green energy policy, we've so far kind of outlined the different threats and current conflict dynamics and how climate change is making those worse, but also how different ongoing conflicts like the one in Gaza is actually driving environmental degradation and climate impacts. Can you give us an overview of the energy transition and the progress within the region itself?
Yes, definitely. And I think I'm glad you asked this question because I feel there's more positive outlooks here than the introduction that we started with.
Nice. Okay. We love a bit of a positive narrative as well.
Yes, always. So I think let's start with the COPs. So the last two COPs happened in the MENA region with the COP27 in Egypt and COP28 in the UAE. And I think this highlighted the MENA region as a region that wants to be engaged in the climate conversation on a global level. I think there's a lot that can be said here about COPs, and COPs can be easily discussed in multiple episodes, not only one episode, to explore, the good, the bad, and the ugly about COPs. Just to be more focused here, I think the climate diplomacy of Egypt was able to gather consensus on establishing the Loss and Damage Fund as a global effort to ensure justice for vulnerable countries and communities that suffered the most from climate change. So they suffered the most from climate change, even though they did not contribute to the problem as much as other developed nations. And this has been a very, very long ask and old ask from developing nations that was ignored. This ignoring has caused much frustration, but it was finally included in COP27. On the other hand, the climate diplomacy of the UAE can also be seen in the COP28, where they were able to include a call to transition away from fossil fuel for the first time. So again, transition away from fossil fuels for the first time being mentioned in a COP final statement. Even just fossil fuels, this is the first mention of fossil fuels in a COP statement. So
Wow.
This is an insane statement, and again shows how historic COP28 was, but also the limits of COP as a mechanism. We've been doing this for 30 years, and everybody knows that fossil fuels is a big part of what's driving climate change, if not the biggest part. But for the first time, it was finally mentioned in a final statement. And ironically, in the UAE, which is seen as one of the petro states. So I think this is really important. And additionally, at COP28, there was a commitment to triple renewable energy and double energy efficiency by 2030. And I think this builds on the earlier commitment to transition away from fossil fuel and sends a really important market signals to increase the investment in renewable energy supply chains and the research and development of energy efficiency. So this, I think, complements the transitioning away. It's not only transitioning away in a theoretical sense, but also we need renewable energy and energy efficiency to come and replace this shift.
Thanks. That's really helpful. I think especially a lot of our listeners coming from maybe the climate, peace, and security bubble have been very focused on the work done by the Egypt presidency and the initiation of this climate responses for sustaining peace initiative, and then the declaration at this last COP on climate relief, recovery, and peace. But it's really helpful to also have mention of some of these historic inclusions of language and different things in the COP negotiating space as well, a little bit more on this climate diplomacy side.
Absolutely.
It's very helpful to have this overview of the international level and the space that these big, or at least headline making discussions are happening. What about on more of a national level, or even smaller than that?
Yeah, so I think the MENA region overall, with the green energy transition, it should be a very important area to look at. So the region is very rich with renewable resources, especially solar and some wind energy too. And this abundance of renewable energy resources, especially solar, has created a boom in renewable energy deployment across the MENA region. The boom was delayed in some countries compared to other regions, but still competitiveness of renewables in the region eventually drove market forces and governments to invest in green energy. Some of the pioneers were Jordan and Morocco, with early legislation and incentives led by the government that led the private sector investment in renewable energy. So for example, now Jordan currently produces around 27% of its electricity using renewable energy, and this is a very significant number on a global scale. And I think after Jordan and Morocco, there were countries like Egypt and the Gulf states that started investing in renewable energy as well. These countries brought in massive scale, which drove prices down in the region because of the scale of these countries. The Gulf region, which historically was portrayed as a skeptic or even as enemy of renewable energy, is actually proving their commitment to the energy transition. some of the biggest renewable energy projects in the world are being constructed in the Gulf region currently. I mean, this shouldn't remove the pressure to reduce fossil fuels, but at the same time, this is a trend that you cannot ignore. So recently, Saudi broke renewable energy records twice with the recent largest single-site solar power plant in Al Shaibiya near Mecca, and the capacity was around 2.6 gigawatts. And in 2021, it also broke a record with the cheapest unsubsidized solar energy bid in the world, which was almost 1.04, I think, cents per kilowatt hour. So these are trends that are on a global scale very, very impressive. And I think, and I guess that this push in the Gulf for renewable energy can be seen as a wise move to stay relevant in the energy sector. It really shows how the driving force of renewable energy economics and cost competitiveness is shaping the future to be renewable. So I was also reading the Bloomberg New Energy Outlook report, and they were saying that even if the world continues as is now, with no further policies to incentivize renewable energy and a green transition, the renewable energy deployment is going to be really, really massive, and it's only going to be 18% less than what we need to invest for a 2050 net zero scenario. So this shows that it's really moving on. And if a region like the MENA region wants to stay relevant in the energy sector, it has to go renewable.
Oh, wow. I have to say, some of those projections are maybe surprising, isn't the right word, but you hear so many of these kind of doomsday scenarios or really negative narratives when it comes to the energy transition and how far we are behind.
Yeah,
But
and the difference, I mean, the 18% is very little, but the difference in what we'll see by 2050 with the increase of temperatures will be disastrous. But it also shows that the market forces are really driving the two scenarios to be at least competitive to each other, right? And this is without actually monetizing any of the human suffering is one of the most important things, but also the losses that we'll see with extreme weather.
Yeah, that's true. I think often kind of when it comes to making this business case, it feels maybe not so human-centered, but
Yeah.
oftentimes it's incredibly effective when you can make this business case and actually incentivize different like national governments to continue making the switch to renewable energy.
Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely agree. And I think in the MENA region, another trend that we have to highlight here is that the growth is not equal. So access to finance and conflict is hindering some countries' energy transition. And renewable energy's big upfront capital cost is a huge barrier for countries with limited access to global markets and financing. And with conflict, this becomes even worse. So basically, with war and conflict, it increases the risk ratings for these countries, which leads to either no financing being available for them or having to deal with very, very high interest rates, which makes projects unappealing, and nobody would want to invest in these projects.
Yeah, that's true. And hopefully, I mean, I guess this episode will come out in June, so we're still a bit of a ways off from COP. But in last year's declaration on this climate relief, recovery, and peace, so many pledges from both national governments who have historically been high emitters, higher income countries, as well as different development banks, pledging to increase this kind of access to finance for countries that are affected by conflict and more fragile. Hopefully, we'll see different countries and these banks living up to those commitments and see a bit more on the implementation side to make this a possibility.
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay, so I think we could keep talking about green energy policy and
Yes.
some of these kind of global negotiations for a while, but I also want to bring in a bit about your experience working at the United Nations Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, and while you were there working on climate change and peace building. And first, I guess a bit of a very broad question. What were some of your key takeaways from doing that work?
So working with a peace building fund under the Department of Political and Peace Building Affairs, and the Peace Building Fund, the acronym is PBF, I'll try to say peace building fund, but sometimes it will escape
Hopefully,
from me.
I think PBF should be well known to a lot of our listeners, so I
Yeah,
think that's
absolutely.
totally fine. We'll keep a few minutes off the podcast, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. So it definitely showed me how important it is to include a climate lens to peace building projects. The climate, peace, and security nexus is very important to tackle in a holistic way. And these three topics really intertwine and influence each other in many ways. So we were talking about a multiplier, but here there's also the multiplier, the root causes, all plays and intertwines together. I think working on one while neglecting the other is just short-sighted and can lead to really disappointing results. And additionally, the worsening climate crisis is causing pressure on situations that used to be perceived as only relatable to peace and security, but now climate is also making it worse or creating new problems. And I think that right now we can see how climate is becoming prevalent in almost all aspects of conflict. So also the Peace Building Fund worked on a climate security and peace building thematic review that I would really, really highly recommend reading.
Perfect. We can link it in the description of the episode. So if you're listening to this, click on the description and we'll link the thematic review.
Yes, perfect. So the report studied 43 climate security projects the PABF funded across 22 countries. And it also zoomed into 3 case studies, including the Liptako-Gorma region, Yemen, and 3 Pacific islands. The thematic review draws on few takeaways. I recommend reading all of it, but I'll try to summarize a few here. So I think one of the most important for me was showing the importance of working on climate security and environmental peace building and focusing on future pressures instead of only focusing on immediate scarcities. So I think that's a theme that was really, really important. Another one is the urgency to prioritize gender and youth programming in climate security work. So this is something that we've always done at the PBF, but I think even in climate security work, this becomes even more important and leads to better results. Also, climate security and environmental issues do not really see borders. So therefore, programming should prioritize cross-border programming as well when possible. And we see many countries that are divided by these just imaginary lines, and it doesn't make sense to work on these imaginary lines. It just doesn't make sense. The climate, the environment, even people still do not see these lines. So we should really try to work on cross-border projects. And of course, this comes at sometimes with its own challenges, but as long as it's possible and relevant, I think it's a very good takeaway. Also, the climate, peace, and security nexus are one of the best ways to engage in extremely fragile environments. They create the possibility to address local sources of violence and strengthen local governance, even in the context of continuing conflict at a national level. So they create a really important and crucial door to work on these problems. And I think finally, maybe the importance of developing criteria for categorizing and tracking climate, peace, and security projects come into hand here. And this helps create KPIs, frameworks, understandings, learning, cross-learning from other organizations. That is really important in a topic that is crucial to tackling peace and security.
That's very true. So peace is one of the things that is kind of notoriously difficult to measure. Do you have any lessons from measuring the impact on the work being done that can be shared?
Yes, absolutely. So I think it's very important to disaggregate as much as possible when working on climate, peace, and security to identify vulnerable and marginalized groups and try to be able to capture how these projects and programs are affecting them. So I think those are 2 of the most important lessons I saw while working with the PBF. And I think it's really important as well to create a learning system, to study how projects are working, what kind of KPIs were useful, and work with different partners as well that work on similar topics to learn from them and to create communities of practice and to create learning material to work on these issues.
Okay, so then in order to bring all these things together, what kind of partnerships are necessary to achieve the energy transition and different goals within the climate, peace, security nexus throughout the MENA region?
A just energy transition is absolutely complex and needs engagement from many stakeholders and building many partnerships. I think in the MENA region, which is probably one of the most complicated regions in the world, a just energy transition also becomes very complicated because of that. And this is where things can look positive. Through different partnerships, it can still be done and actually create opportunities for peace and social cohesion. So multilateral development agencies and multilateral banks come into mind here. It is very, very important for these big organizations that can offer financing to signal their support and commitment to the energy transition. They also need to emphasize that the energy transition has to be just on many levels, such as social and environmental aspects. I think one of the most important steps they can help with is offering affordable financing for the green transition. So developing nations, again, usually have to suffer from higher interest rates when lending from financial markets to account for the perceived risks to invest in these countries. But multilateral institutions can come here and mitigate and give guarantees that can lower the interest rates for these developing countries. So this makes a huge difference in the feasibility of renewable energy projects that are very capital intensive. So one example is the Bridgetown Agenda led by Barbados, which is working to advocate for organizations such as the World Bank and the IMF to influence the global financial system to be able to finance more clean energy projects in developing countries. I think speaking of partnerships, also aid agencies and NGOs come into mind here, and they can lead programs such as technical support and policy support programs to help countries in the region create the business environment that is needed to attract the private sector investments in renewable energy, especially those countries trailing behind. They can also work on funding programs that equip youth and marginalized groups with the right skills to be able to find employment in renewable energy projects. And finally, I would say that the private sector has a big role to contribute here, and public-private partnerships are much needed to work on the just energy transition. The needs of the private sector should be understood and met to make investments in such projects attractive. But at the same time, we need to ensure that the transition is just and equitable.
So one of the things that we've touched upon already in this episode is a lot of the different learnings, making them accessible and what can and should be shared. So to round us out for our episode today, you've worked quite a bit to make publicly available different data to make it more user-friendly, accessible, and also enhance visualization, which I think is always an ongoing conversation. What learnings can other organizations, institutions, maybe take away from this? Or did you have any recommendations?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think working on this project made us see how digital access to data and visualization can really increase transparency and build trust with different stakeholders. So this transparency creates accountability and a deeper sense of responsibility on the implementing side too. So it's very important. It helps all stakeholders on both sides, I think. The availability of public data also helps create synergies in learning and improving programming between institutions working on similar topics. So this is, again, very important for different organizations working on a topic that is very important, such as climate, peace, and security, to have this visibility on each other's work. Of course, here it comes to mind that some data is sensitive, but as long as that data is somehow masked or hidden, I think it's really important to allow public access. In the project you were mentioning, we also worked with different smaller organizations and fund to pool resources to create a shared platform to publish public data. And I think here we saw how doing so overcomes financial and technical burdens for each organization to create their own platform. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. And at the same time, it really shows how the shared platform can increase the visibility for all stakeholders. So I think the synergies in this regard is very, very important.
I like the fact that you highlighted these synergies and the need for a shared platform. I have to say, I sometimes am a bit of a dashboard skeptic, where it feels like there's so much information out
Yes,
there. Granted, some are very, very useful. I have to preface that, but there's so many out there that feels like because of this lack of coordination, a
absolutely.
donor or someone helping to fund a project wants this and no one is talking to each other. So then there's maybe 7 dashboards that really don't quite work or
Yes,
don't have
that's
the right
very classic.
information. Yeah, yeah.
Or even they feel redundant, even if they have different information. I
Yes,
think when you have to click on 7 different links, people don't have the patience for that. But when you have everything in one dashboard or on one platform, it becomes much easier to switch between the different
yep.
data sets and the different organizations. And again, I think it really makes sense, especially for smaller organizations, to pool their funds, to pool their technical resources and make one shared platform or dashboard.
Yeah, certainly. I think one of the things that you've also kind of highlighted quite a bit throughout our conversation is that the MENA region is often viewed as very complicated and very politically sensitive. And you've highlighted also ongoing conflicts like the war in Gaza. And of course, it kind of goes without saying at this point that that is viewed as a very political conflict. And a lot of our listeners are in this kind of policy space, whether or not that's for organizations or different foreign offices themselves. So I'm wondering, as we actually close out, if you have any messages or any advice, or even just simply any thoughts for engaging within the region.
Yeah, that's also a very good question. I
Yeah,
think
could also another
not an easy one.
episode.
Yeah, it could be easily, but let me try and summarize. So I think it's really important to bring local voices into the table. I think it's really important to prioritize these voices and listen to them. And people from the region are usually very open to having these conversations, to discussing, to raising awareness. So just talk to people. I think that's really important. And something else, I think these topics can get political, and again, they are political. And I'm not against talking about political context, but I get it how sometimes it's more sensitive or you're in a setting that it's harder to talk about these topics. So I think going to credible resources like other organizations that are well accredited is a really good way of focusing the conversation on the technical aspect of the humanitarian crisis that is happening there and not going into the weeds of the politics, but focusing on the humanitarian problem, the climate problem that is happening, and not going into these conversations that could be viewed as toxic or as leading to raising sensitivities. So I think, again, just going to credible sources of information can be very helpful to mitigate that.
Yeah, I think this focus of looking at these technical aspects and different sources like the UN and this credible evidence base that exists, that makes sense. One of the things that, I mean, we've already mentioned the phrasing today in the episode, but evidence-based policy making.
Yeah,
And this ties into that.
I agree. Yes.
Okay, anything else that you want to say or different thoughts that have popped up throughout our conversation, or whether topics or just specific things that you want to mention?
Yeah, maybe I think just as a closing remark, generally the MENA region is usually only seen as a place where war happens, where conflict is prevailing. But I think this region has lots of opportunities and there's lots of amazing work that's being done from activist groups to big scale projects on renewable energy that people should discover and be open to learning about. So I think this is something that is very close to my heart, and I would really encourage all the listeners to learn more. I would encourage different organizations to look at the Middle East and the MENA region, be open to starting new programming there, and not only view it as a place where it's only war and conflict.
Thanks so much for joining us for this episode and sharing these different insights.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
In today's episode, we've discussed how climate change, heat waves, and water shortages are impacting the region, including the humanitarian situation in Gaza, as well as access to electricity. We've also looked at the climate footprint of reconstruction efforts in the region and progress led by countries in the MENA region at the global level, as well as investments in green energy and successes at the national level. We've examined how the climate, peace, and security nexus can be tackled in a holistic way that builds synergies and mutual progress. This was the Climate Diplomacy Podcast. We will be back with another episode in a few weeks. In fact, we will be back with episode 42. And as 42 is the answer to everything, Raquel and I will be having a special episode of the podcast where listeners can submit questions about climate, peace, and security ahead of time. You can write into editor@climate-diplomacy.org or write us on Twitter @ClimateDiplo or on LinkedIn @Climate Diplomacy and Security. We look forward to hearing from you. Thank you for tuning in. Until next time, goodbye.